So welcome everybody. It's the seventh episode of the Scars and Stands podcast with your host, the one, the only Josh Ricker. Today, I would like to welcome a very special friend of the program, Will Hyland. Me and Will got to know each other working for the Portland Sea Dogs as interns. For those of you who don't know, the Sea Dogs are one of the minor league affiliates for the Red Sox of Major League Baseball for all the European guys listening out there. Will went to Colby Sawyer in New Hampshire and is a blogger himself, just like me. True New Englander, of course, Pats, Bruins, and Red Sox fan. However, Will finally switched over to the dark side and picked a Premier League club to support. We're happy to have him on this week to learn about his journey into Premier League footy fandom. Will, how's it going, man?
It's going well, Josh. Thanks for having me on the program. I'm very excited to chat with you tonight about all of these things. And I think, like most people across the world, like it's going. It might be going well. It might be going not well. I think we're just going. So always like taking the time to talk sports because it's an escape from all our real world issues that we have.
I couldn't agree more. And, soccer more than anything. Soccer's been there for me, when we've had to stay inside, it was tough when the Premier League got shut down last year. I know that was tough for me with no sports on. So I know sports relieve a lot of people and it's important to have them on right now. Speaking of major sports going on right now, first thing I got to ask you is thoughts on Tom Brady winning number 7, not in a Patriots jersey with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Well, yeah, great question. Love starting it on the American side of things. Totally hard not to root for someone like him. As I mentioned right before we got on, he's just a winner everywhere he goes. It's hard as someone who grew up here in New England to not root for him, given that he was, the catalyst behind so many childhood memories in American football. So I'm very, I was very torn at first early in the year, but as the season went on, I actually learned to like that Buccaneers team almost as much as I liked the Patriots team. They just were a likable group. So seeing him win number 7 was a little bittersweet. Wish he was doing it in a Pats uniform, but still happy that he kind of put to rest any further debate on whether he's the GOAT of American football.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think it was important to talk about just having you from New England. And, we're talking about football today. It might not be American football, but I'll have that video about the discrepancy of American football and soccer in a future video. But we'll get into some soccer questions because that's what you're here for today.
Totally.
My first question is, when did you start interacting with soccer? Was it in high school? Did you play? Was it in college? A lot of people, start interacting with it at different times. My dad started interacting with the game when he was, 50, when I got him into it. So, tell us a little bit about how you got at least a little bit interested in the game.
Sure. So it's kind of 2 points of my life where I can look at and say, both positively and negatively. When I was a kid, I tried playing when I was I want to say 5 or 6, elementary school, primary school. I began trying it, and I think I lasted a couple weeks, maybe even a couple days. I really can't remember because it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this really isn't a sport for me.
Yeah.
I was more of a hands-on person, and I would hate it when the coaches would be like, no, you can't touch the ball in the hands. What do you mean I can't touch the ball in my hands? And as a kid, it's like you go and get a ball and you throw a ball, you kick a ball, but then you go and pick it up with your hands and bring it back to so it was kind of like,
it goes against everything they teach you in America about sports. In England, they grow up and that's all. So there's nothing against it. In America, you're always touching, throwing balls, carrying them. So when it's put at your feet and you're told, that's against the rules, you want to rebel as much as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you're playing soccer in your backyard, eventually, the ball goes out of bounds, you go and pick it up. But when that happens on the pitch, you're not supposed to go do that. So yeah, that was my childhood interaction with the game. But I think what really sort of gauged my interest as a adolescent kid was both the 2010 and 2014 World Cups.
Okay.
I was actually very influenced by my baseball coach. I grew up playing baseball, and my baseball coach growing up was he was my teacher as well. He was a huge Arsenal fan.
Okay.
So when I was in seventh grade during the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, he sort of made that almost a social studies project. Like, it was right around the end of the year, and it was sort of like a geography lesson in and of itself. And I, as someone who loves sports, I was like, great. This isn't like a real school, we're talking about sports here. So the 2010 World Cup was kind of a focal point of me just recognizing the impact that had on the world stage. And then in 2014 was when the U.S. had that fairly good run. I wouldn't say a great run. It wasn't like in 2010 when I believe they lost to Ghana.
Yeah, quarterfinals, I believe. Yeah.
So in 2014 they had a decent run. That was also when I started getting into Twitter, because I was 16, 17 years old. And there was a hashtag going around that was like things Tim Howard could save, because he had such an enormous performance for the wins that they had. There was that game that I remember watching, and my family was like, "You watch soccer? What are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, they're playing Portugal, and Ronaldo is on, Team Portugal." And I was like, "This is a big moment for the U.S." And I remember, I can't remember specifically the match, but I know if things had gone a different way, there was a possibility that they could have played Argentina on the 4th of July. And I believe that would have probably been the most anticipated soccer match.
It probably would have been the watermark of soccer as we know it. I think for most people who follow the U.S. men's team, that watermark moment's still probably 2010 when they beat Algeria, like Landon Donovan. I talk about that in the podcast about the 2010 World Cup. We have one of the scarves on the end here. I think it's over there, the USA 2010 scarf. Yeah. But yeah, if they would have played Argentina on the 4th of July, that would have been crazy, and it probably would have shattered any current ratings record for soccer in the U.S.
Absolutely. And I just remember that being sort of a letdown. And then the fact that, again, I'm not a huge expert in the terms, but a couple of years later, they actually missed out on 2018.
Yeah, so that goes into my next question. The 2018 World Cup, when we interned together at the Sea Dogs, that was going on right in the heat of the summer. And I remember some of the guys put it on the big screen in the outfield before the game. So like before fans would come in, that was on. I remember kind of watching some of the bigger games. England made it to the semifinals. There was a couple big runs. Obviously, without the U.S. in it, takes a lot away. We see the U.S. women succeeding so much because they're great, influential women. And then the men don't qualify. It's hard to really build interest when, your men's team doesn't qualify on the world's biggest stage,
Yeah, oh, totally. And thanks for bringing up the women's national team too, because around that same time, so that period when I was like exiting high school and beginning college was around the time that they won in 15. The women's team won in 15, and they actually played the final against Japan in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is my dad's hometown. So I remember us watching that game together in, I believe, it would have been 2015. But in 2018, even without the US there, that was kind of when I started following soccer from a more of an entertainment value standpoint rather than a, patriotic, USA sports standpoint. And, I remember you and I had some conversations about our FIFA Ultimate Teams, and I would, play it on my iPhone, and because I don't have a console. So that's kind of how I learned about the club structure around the world. When I started looking at it from that point of view was when I was like building my team. I would learn about players in different countries that were also playing in the World Cup at the same time. So I think that was pretty influential in my interest of becoming a fan, for sure.
And I would say kind of like what I took from you that summer is like, I could see you as like, you're one of those people that was like right on the fence of like being a fan, like investing yourself, but you didn't know how to go about it. Because in soccer, it's so complicated, and you have all these competitions going on, like the Premier League's over. So you're like, okay, it's everything's over for the season. And then a couple weeks later, you have the Champions League final, and everyone's telling you, no, this is like the biggest game. It takes a while to understand the setup.
Totally.
So that's what kind of gave me the inspiration, like the next summer, to write my book, On the Front Foot, A Guide to Being a Premier League Fan in America. I want to know, did the book actually help you kind of understand some concepts around the game, Premier League and stuff?
Yeah, it did, and I loved it. It was actually, I bought it because it's not often that a friend of yours, writes a book about
Hmm.
sports. So I got it, because I knew that A, like you said, I was interested in learning more about the game, and B, that you wrote it, and I knew you, and we had worked together, and we're both writers. So I was like, this will be an
Hmm.
entertaining use of time, and yeah, it did help me. It started, very basic, just you explaining sort of the different stages that happen for a new fan was actually very much a mirror of what was going on with me.
Hmm.
And then I'd say that the most important part about the book that I took away from that you wrote was the glossary itself, because that was one of the things as I had watched, was like people would reference stuff and people would say things and I wouldn't know what that meant,
Hmm.
especially because just in general, you know, English people, Australians, Canadians, Americans, we speak English, as countries fluently, but we also have different words for different things outside of sport.
Hmm.
So then when you add on sports as a institution, which leads way to a lot of different jargon in and of itself, it's actually a source of a lot of our phrases that we use outside in our normal day-to-day interaction.
Hmm.
So just not being familiar with how English people, what they call things outside of sport, then when you get into sports where there's so many different other terms, that
Yeah.
was very helpful. Was the glossary, I'd have to say, was the best part.
Yeah, and I've honestly thought about doing a second edition because obviously in the meantime I've went to England and spent 3 months.
That's right.
So you actually go to the grounds and you hear regular everyday people use those words, and that's their way of talking, and you learn so much more about the culture and how soccer affects these people day-to-day lives. It's truly some people, it's their whole life. Their life is work, and then after work it's, how did the team do today? Where's the training pictures? Stuff like that. And
Totally.
it's insane. So I thought about doing a second edition, adding some more keywords. And obviously back then my writing was super raw. I've had a few more years experience and
Yeah.
just obviously marketing. So pushing the book and actually getting some more traction in a second edition, something I've definitely thought about. But I'd like to get into the question I think most people are
Sure.
waiting for is, what club do you support and how did you choose them?
Okay, so I have to admit, I'm going to start with a prop to kind of give a hint. And here's the prop. All right. Now, you and I know you're a big Liverpool guy. And
Mm-hmm.
so here's my hint before I reveal is both of our clubs have had a tough go of it as of late. Um, that being said, my club is Tottenham Hotspur, and the reason being is actually kind of unique in and of itself. So I guess the best way to describe how I got to be interested in Tottenham was basically, I don't know how this happened, but I came down to like four teams or
Mm-hmm.
four clubs, I should say. That's what English people say, so that's what I'll try and say. But they had four clubs, and I was like, okay, um, I could be a front runner because I had friends that liked United, and I was like, okay, I could be United. I could like United because that's what my friends like.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of close friends of mine that like United. I was like, or I could go and like Liverpool because as a Red Sox fan, as you know, as a diehard Reds fan, is that Liverpool is owned by Fenway Sports Group, who also owns the Boston Red Sox. So I said that could be a reasonable number two.
Mm-hmm.
I could like um, I could like Man City because they have been successful and they could kind of be the antithesis of United, which my friends like. So I could kind of do the opposite and kind of be the rival of my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also kind of for a minute thought about Everton and I was like, nah. And then
Good
and
choice.
then yeah, and then I was like, what about these guys? Like I like Harry Kane. I knew who Harry Kane was.
Mm-hmm.
I was, he kind of had an interesting sort of, I would say like almost like quintessential athlete like demeanor about him, like world star athlete, like
Yeah.
kind of the face of English football in a way, like the new face in a way. So I was like, I kind of like this guy. Like he's going to be around a while. Like he's a
Mm-hmm.
good player. He's very good. And then I said, okay, like I'll look into these guys more. And they were actually, I liked their kit. Their 2017-18 kit was the year that I started my FIFA Ultimate Team. So I actually had their kit be my kit. So that's how kind of the weird way.
Mm-hmm.
But then what really happened was Amazon Prime released the All or Nothing.
That's what I was waiting for.
Series. And as you and I had talked over the fall when they released that, I was like, okay, like I hadn't really made up my mind yet. I was kind of like leaning Spurs, but then when I saw that there was a documentary about Man City, I was like, okay, well, they're the defending champions. That would be kind of front runner. Sorry, they were the champions before Liverpool, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like that would kind of be a front runner if I kind of went for City. It's like, okay, like I'll watch. And then the Leeds one, like I had a close friend who liked Leeds, and they were kind of an up and coming story, but I was like, I'll watch Spurs because I was sort of interested in them before. And then when I started watching that documentary and I got to know some of the players a little bit beyond,
Mm-hmm.
what I had seen on social media or whatnot, like, and there was Jose, like that just became a very intriguing thing for me. And I was like glued to that after.
It's so funny because how I came, I've told this story before on the podcast and other sources, but that's how I fell in love with Liverpool, was Being Liverpool, which was like a little mini series that was released on Nessun right after Fenway. Yeah, right after Fenway bought Liverpool. And that was like the tie I needed to the Red Sox. And it was all I needed to fall in love with that team. I don't know why, because they were a little bit crap back then. But, well, I just fell in love with the culture, and, it went from there. So it's really interesting to hear that you had the same story. Those documentaries are kind of like bantered a little bit in England, where people think they're kind of like jokes. They kind of almost like make fun of the club a little bit. It's like a pity thing.
Yeah.
And in America, that's like a legitimate source for like getting a worldwide like fandom. That you have to release that stuff to get fans all over the world. And I think Tottenham have really became like a worldwide club in the past few years. One, because of the stadium, really good players, Champions League final, and then releasing that documentary on a worldwide stage all at the same time is perfect formula.
Yeah, and I didn't even mention that Champions League final. That I remember watching the highlights after that. I was like, wow, like this is legit. Like this is a cool sport.
Yeah,
and it's hard to get match footage, as I'm sure you're aware of, over here in the States afterward. I mean, NBC has a little bit of it, but
afterward, especially if it's Europe, it's tough.
Yeah, you really have to go to the social media accounts of the clubs themselves to find anything.
Because a lot of it gets restricted. If it's from like Sky Sports or whatever, you can't watch a video here in America. So it's kind of a drawback. One of the biggest parts about Tottenham, I actually went to the stadium when I was in England 3 days after Jose got hired. So obviously, if you know Jose, I apologize for mispronouncing.
That's okay.
If you know him, he's been everywhere. He's one using that the English kind of vernacular. He loves to take the piss. It's a definition that doesn't really have a translation to English besides maybe like being a dickhead, honestly.
Yeah,
and
probably.
Jose epitomizes that, and obviously coached at Chelsea twice. And I remember hearing when I was in England that Jose was like a front runner for the Tottenham job, and they kind of kept it quiet. And then they announce it, and it's like, how? He is literally like the opposite of what you think Tottenham would be beforehand, whereas like this nice club, and like a lot of the players are really just nice and exciting. Like you look at Heung-min Son, like always has a smile on his face. And now you have this hard ass coming in that's literally completely the opposite. And what do you think of him so far?
Well, much of my early I'd say early impressions of Jose were from All or Nothing. And so I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the manager before his last name correctly.
Pochettino.
Yes. Yeah. So when that documentary began, it was his last few matches, and then the transition that you just spoke about. So when they brought him in, I remember one of the first things that got me like kind of hooked on him. And I know he's controversial in England for a lot of different ways, his past and his style and whatnot. But when he just he just went in front of the team and he was like, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Like, it's
Yeah.
like, it is exactly what you thought. And I thought, like, I don't really, I usually don't gravitate to that kind of leader, but something about him was like, okay, like this guy, when he walks in, he knows the history in the club because being a manager in the Premier League before, and for other storied franchises or clubs. And Daniel Levy brought him in for a reason, and I remember they were interviewing fans as part of that documentary, and one of them said, like, we never get trophies. We never get trophies. Jose's coming. We're going to get a trophy. And I was like, okay, so people look at this guy as like a winner. So, and I like winners. So I liked him from then on. But I mean, as in recent weeks, there's been some rumors about him and about his future with Spurs and his, does his leadership work? Is he losing the locker room or the dressing room?
I'll give Jose credit too, like where it's due. Yeah. He's had a lot of injury problems since he became the manager. Definitely. He's had 2 stints where I think was doing really well. One was at the beginning of this year and just completely decimated by injury. So part of it's not his fault. But like you said, I think Tottenham needed to bring in someone that was going to win trophies. When you have a player like Harry Kane, we're going to get into him next. He's kind of not threatened, but extremely loyal. And he's stayed at the club long enough to give them a chance to win trophies, bring in a different manager. He stayed through the Pochettino project and, 2 goals could have won them a Champions League final. So they were close. They were very close. And, Kane stayed there. He's been loyal and he's staying through Jose. And if Jose doesn't work, you could see Kane leaving. So bringing in a manager like that, that's like a proper guy, I think was needed, even though it was a culture shock and went against everything Spurs stood for. It was needed in the moment because Spurs are on a little bit of a hot seat for winning a trophy.
They are, and they have opportunities in front of them. It's going to be hard to finish in the top 4 and get the chance to qualify again. But at the same time, they're in pretty good standing with some of those, secondary tournaments and cups that they're competing in. So I don't rule it out for him. I wish him the best. Like I said, I know he's been controversial in terms of his hire and whatnot, but I really think that they'd be better off just sticking with him for the remainder, at least until the summer. I mean, if he gets if they lose to West Ham and they start going further down a spiral, I could see them maybe sacking him. But I think Daniel Levy's put a lot of investment into Jose Mourinho, and I think they want him to succeed because they know that even if they win
Europa League, they're still in.
Yeah, the Carabao
Cup. Yep, they're in that too as well.
Yeah, if they win that, and that could be enough to buy him time for next Premier League.
Yeah, and Levy is a guy he's kind of like John Henry, where he sits on a manager. He's not quick like Chelsea to pull the trigger, like Chelsea firing Lampard after a year and a half, like a club legend. He's going to give Jose time, make sure he has the proper resources. So I don't see them pulling the trigger midway through the season, especially when Kane's kind of on the fence. He could easily demand a transfer this summer.
And that would be devastating.
It would crush Tottenham. And we'll get into Harry Kane right now.
Sure, yeah.
Great player.
Love him.
I don't want to like him because he usually does good against Liverpool for some reason, except in that Champions League final. I have the pleasure to say I've watched him score in the game I went to when they played Liverpool at Anfield. So that's a cool brag. He's expressed interest in the NFL as a kicker before. My first question is, would he be better than Cody Parkey? And then I want to go back to what you said about him being kind of he's like the face of the sport in England a little bit, especially in London. He reminded me a few years ago so much of Tom Brady, and minus the winning, but just he's a class athlete in terms of his attitude, his drive. The loyalty is one thing, sticking with Spurs when he clearly could have went elsewhere. He really is just a class player. But the second question is obviously, would he be better than Cody Parkey as an NFL kicker?
Well, okay, Cody Parkey missed a pretty big kick, but he's still in the NFL for a reason.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, the NFL has had some bad kickers. I mean, my New England Patriots drafted a guy in the 6th round who didn't even make the opening squad because he couldn't make a field goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there are some bad kickers in the NFL, and we have seen some soccer players make that leap. I think Cairo Santos also played for the Chicago Bears and the Kansas City Chiefs, and he was a Brazilian soccer player who was converted to an NFL kicker or a college kicker, then an NFL kicker while he was in school. So I mean, it can certainly happen. But if I were Kane, I mean, I'm 20. I just looked up his age while you were introducing him. He's 28 years old, which is about the age that I could remember him being. If I were him, I would stick with.
Yeah, Kane's made of glass a little bit too. He's known to have an injury once in a while. I think he gets hit by a 270-pound linebacker. He might, be going back to England pretty fast.
Yeah, and if I were him, like we were just saying, he has so much going for him in England between the national team and Spurs and his persona and the way that he carries himself in a very professional manner. If you bring yourself over here, especially to the NFL, which I would say is about on par with the Premier League in terms of its success in its own country.
Mm-hmm.
He would be subjecting himself to the physical, stuff that you mentioned, as well as just the, being looked at in the media as like, this English guy is coming over here and trying to play football. Like, what is this? People would kind of rag on him a little bit. And he's just such a gifted, association football player that it would be foolish of him to leave that behind.
But I agree with that.
Maybe if he's 40 years old, I mean, there's some NFL kickers that are pretty up there in age. I mean, Adam Vinatieri was, I think, 44 when he retired. Mm-hmm. So if he gets up there in age and he doesn't have the speed that he has now, sure. But beyond that, no, I would stay in England and play football there.
So, obviously your relationship with soccer, football in general is rather short. What do you think makes the sport so captivating for people like you that are kind of transitioning, not from American sports, but you're adding it to your slate of teams?
Well, I think what makes it, so interesting to us as Americans, especially people that want to add a sport, like you said, is that it's different. They have all these intertwined things, like they have Europa League, Champions League, they have the Premier League, obviously, in which its structure in and of itself is very unique in how they award champions and how they award qualifiers for other tournaments. So I think that part of it is very unique and attractive to American fans in terms of its captivation. And also the branding behind it. I mean, you and I are both sports marketing gurus.
Yeah.
You can't look at the Premier League without just completely applauding the sports marketing work that they do. So I think that those combinations for me, that combination for me is something that really drew me to the sport. And I think that's why it's so captivating. It's just because it's different. And it kind of adds a little bit of a layer of, intricacy to it. Like, Americans, a lot of the sports that we like are very like, this is what happens. It happens immediately. And we can't wait around, like even baseball, like the America's pastime, people are trying to change that sport so that it's faster and quicker. And it's like, well, if you watched, English football, you would know that there are barely any commercial breaks. The clock continues.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, we don't have to wait around, but at the same time, it's not a instant gratification sport. They're not going to score every time they're on attack. There's a little bit of a grace to it but also not a slow pace. So it kind of walks a balance of, okay, it's not as fast as NBA basketball, but it's not as slow as MLB baseball.
Yeah.
So I think that's another reason that makes it so captivating. It's just the intricacy of it and how delicate it is.
Yeah, and I think there's good parts and drawbacks of the sport. Timing of day is a big one. It depends on where you are in the country. Obviously, West Coast, you have that 3 hours. You can get if you're in the 7:30 slot, you have to wake up 4:30 to watch your team if you live in LA. So there is some time drawbacks just from living in America.
Yeah.
Also, you could almost consider it a pro if you're on the East Coast because it gives you a part of your day where you never had any live sports. For me, it was always something to like wake up and do with my parents, like when I'm home, like watch Liverpool, like have breakfast. So there is some things like where you can turn the bad parts of it into good parts. I think if people give it a chance, it's hard. Like the first time you watch a Premier League game and you wake up early, like 8 or 9 o'clock, and it's a 0-0 draw. It's hard to like justify that to people. But if you do give it a chance, I feel like you get sucked in so fast with like the team culture, the songs, when fans are in the terraces.
Totally.
Like baseball is like a sport where like I love baseball to death, but you go with friends, you go with your family, get a couple beers, a hot dog, whatever. Soccer's a sport where you go, you stand on those terraces and sing, and it's so serious. Like it's taken so seriously. It's like life or death. And we just don't have something like as crazy as that in America. And I think adding it, and the first time people really go and experience it, whether that's like preseason tours, like when Liverpool comes to Fenway, or if people like me that do get the chance to go over and experience a game, when you feel that for the first time, it's like, it's almost like a drug. It's so captivating. And it's a sport unlike the ones we have right now in America.
Yeah, totally. And the only other drawback I'd say would be access to television viewing.
I agree with that completely as well.
I mean, you and I could do an entire podcast on that alone. Is just
explaining all
TV.
of the different things. Right now, I think I have Sling, Peacock, CBS Sports to watch the Champions League, ESPN Plus to watch the League Cup and the FA Cup. You have to have the whole package if you want to watch every game.
Yeah, and I mean, NBC does a good job with the coverage. It's just getting that coverage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because what they put on, like, the local NBC affiliate that's broadcast TV and Freedom Everyone is usually the big games, like the London Derby, or they'll have like, Liverpool and Everton, or Liverpool and Man United, what they think is going to get the most number of U.S. fans to watch. It's not necessarily the games of the club that you might be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's only been one time where Spurs have been on NBC Day. Most of the time they're on the NBC Sports Network at like 7 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
So I think or they're on Peacock, which I don't have.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree with you. You and I could do an entirely different show all about that.
It can be tough. And, because of time restrictions on Zoom, I got to cut to the last question. We need to upgrade to get the premium Zoom. But
exactly.
Last question is, what can soccer do to grow its presence here? The Fan Fest before COVID, I obviously went to one in Boston, really popular. And it sucks to see NBC Sports like going out of business potentially. I don't know where that Premier League content is going to get put. If it's going to go to USA Network or all on Peacock, that might have been why they started to make that transition last year.
Probably.
But it seems like the coverage of the sport has grown a lot in the past 5 years, especially Premier League clubs. What do you think it's going to take for them to be like one of the main guys at the table in America? Or do you think it's ever going to get to that point?
I personally, and I had this debate with a couple of college professors back when I was in, when I was in school, and we basically came to the conclusion that the Premier League will always be bigger than the MLS in terms of its like rigor. Like MLS will never have the amount of, TV support, I don't think, on a national level that the Premier League has, which is strange because it's not our country's league. But I don't think it will ever get into that top 5, top 6 conversation. I think people will still look to college, United States NCAA sports before it. And I think that people will still sort of watch the MLS.
And the MLS is more of a complement than a substitute to the Premier League, just because, like you said, it's not the same rigor, and it's tough because a lot of it goes into like being able to go to games, and like it's where you went to college or it's where the area you're from, and there's a lot that goes into being an American sports fan, not to take anything away from it.
Yeah.
So until Premier League maybe starts doing something like what the NFL does in London, and there's actual games like that mean something and aren't just preseason games, or you get half of the bench and a couple starters playing, it will be tough to grow. And I acknowledge that, even though I wish the Premier League could break into that big 5 American sports, but there's definitely setbacks that are reasons why it'll never be one of the most attended sports in America. I think it'll grow in popularity. I think it'll continue because it is definitely a progressive sport that people are more interested in now.
Totally. And the 2026 World Cup, which again, you and I could do a whole episode on how that could impact US fandom. But I think the 2026 World Cup, which is shared amongst the three North American countries, will make a difference. That will be our time to really, now hopefully COVID-19 will be over by then, and we'll really be able to capitalize on that. So on a more optimistic note, I know I was a little pessimistic before. On a more optimistic note, that could make all the difference. And I know we're running short on time, but I did notice your last question when we talked before was about who I thought would win the league. And I know we have a couple more, like just a little bit more. And I gotta just say that Man City's the popular pick. That's what everyone's going to say, and they're probably the most likely to. You're
gonna say United?
But I wouldn't rule out Leicester. And
I don't know.
I don't know. It just seems like they surprise people. You know, I don't think Spurs have been the same since they lost to Leicester in early December, I believe. So they have a way of surprising people. I don't know.
Big win against Liverpool too last weekend. I'll give them that.
Correct. I know. But if I had to say, it's obviously Man City with the way that they're playing right now. 16 in a row, I believe. It's
crazy. But we'll wrap up the episode there. Thank you all for coming on. We appreciate it. I think it's going to be a good episode. I think fans will like it. We'll try to have you on again, maybe if Spurs win a league title. But thank you for coming on, man. It was great catching up.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll chat later. It's great being on with you, Josh, and happy to come on anytime.
Perfect. Have a good one, man.
You too. Bye.